The market at Aldemar spread across 3 connected squares and 2 covered lanes, and on days when the trade was good, the noise of it carried all the way to the eastern ridge. Nell had walked it so many times she could have navigated it with her eyes closed. The grain merchant in the second square, the herbalist at the far west end of the covered lane, the cartwright's stall near the south gate where the boy worked Thursdays and never asked questions. She arrived before the crowds thickened, basket on her arm, hood pulled against the morning cold. The sky above the market was the gray of early autumn, pale and undecided, and her breath fogged in front of her. Around her, merchants were stacking and arranging and calling to each other across the lane, in voices still rough with sleep. She went to the herbalist first. Old Peter was already sorting bundles when she reached his stall, fingers moving through dried stalks and bark strips with the ease of someone who had done the same thing for 30 years. He did not look up. "Early," he said. "Always." She set the coins on the edge of his table. The same amount, always the same, no discussion required. He reached under the table and produced a cloth bundle tied with plain cord. She tucked it into the bottom of her basket before the woman at the neighboring stall had time to look over. She didn't linger. She never lingered here. The bundle would last her 4 weeks, maybe 5 if she measured carefully and didn't make the mistake of thinking she could skip a day. She had tried that once, 18 months ago, 3 days before a designation sweep in a village east of here. The wolf had pushed itself to the surface in the middle of a crowded road in full daylight, and she had pressed herself against a wall and spent 10 minutes convincing her own body that it would not shift, not here, not now, not with people watching. She had not skipped a dose since. The problem was that Peter was in Aldemar and she was leaving for the capital in 2 days. There was no one in Drenthal she trusted for this. The supply in the bundle would run out somewhere in her 3rd or 4th week at court, and after that she would be managing with nothing, which was not a problem she had a clean solution to yet. She went to the grain merchant next. 2 sacks waited under the name she used for network deliveries. She paid and arranged for them to be left at an address 3 streets east of the market, then moved on to the south lane where the cartwright's boy worked. He was loading wheel rims into a rack along the south wall. He was 17 and knew nothing about the network except that a woman sometimes paid him to leave a cart unlocked near the south road on specific nights. She passed him the coins without slowing. He pocketed them without looking at her. Thursday night. South Road. 2 Omegas, a woman named Dora and her younger sister, would reach the road by midnight if the timing held. Bryn would meet them. After that, they were Bryn's to manage, and Bryn knew the northern roads better than anyone. There was one more to move before Nell left for the capital. Tess. 19 years old, recently registered. The kind of name that appeared early on the council's designation priority lists. Tess was still 10 days from being ready to travel, and Nell would be gone before she could see it through. She had told Bryn this. Bryn had told her not to worry. Nell worried anyway. It was the part of this work she could never put down. She was crossing back through the main square, basket repacked, mind already on the afternoon, when she saw the guards. They wore the crowned wolf in gold thread, the king's own crest, not a lord's, not a council steward's. She registered it without alarm. Royal retinues moved through Aldemar regularly, and she had heard horns the night before and paid them no more thought than she paid the wind. But guards in royal livery moving through a market at dawn were doing something specific. They were clearing the square, methodical, working the edges inward, pulling men to their feet, checking faces, directing anyone without obvious business toward the exits. She had seen this pattern before. The designation ceremony was 6 weeks out, and in the weeks before it, the king's agents swept the outer cities for unregistered Omegas who'd slipped the census rolls. Her papers named her a registered beta. She had nothing to fear from a sweep. She kept walking. The shout came from the direction of the fountain. A guard had a man by the collar. The man was wrapped in a coat, repaired so many times it had stopped resembling any original garment, hunched slightly at the shoulder with the stiffness of someone who had been cold for too long. He was not fighting. He was simply standing in the space where he'd been standing when the guard found him, which was apparently sufficient cause. The baton came up. Nell moved. It was not a decision she made. It was the reflex of years, The same one that had made her step between a guard and a boy 2 winters past. The same one that had made her push an unlocked door open and tell 4 people inside to stay quiet and not move. The reflex had no hesitation in it. It simply went. She crossed 10 feet of square and stepped beside the man and took his arm. "Uncle," she heard herself say it with perfect steadiness. "There you are. I've been to the east stalls and back looking for you." The guard's baton stopped. His eyes moved from the man to her. "You know this beggar?" "He's not a beggar. He's my uncle." She kept her hold on the man's arm. "He gets turned around in crowds. He's been unwell this past month." A brief pause. "I should have stayed closer. I'm sorry for the trouble." She shrugged her coat off and settled it around the man's shoulders without releasing him. It was a practical adjustment. Without the coat, he looked more like something to be cleared, and a man being collected by family read differently than a man with no one to collect him. The guard looked between them. Then he turned toward the rest of the crowd. There were easier problems 20 feet away. She steered the man into the shadow of a canvas-covered stall and kept moving until the guard's back was fully turned. Under the canvas, she checked him quickly, looking for injury, for the emptied expression that followed a blow to the head. She found neither. He was watching her with full attention, steady and direct, and there was nothing in it that looked like relief. She filed that. She did not linger on it. "Stay off the main square until the sweep moves on," she said. "South Road is clear of them. At the end of the farrier's lane, there's a well. Wait there until the crowd shifts and the guards move on." She did not stay to see if he would follow the directions. She picked up her basket and walked. Her coat was a 2-winter loss. She let it go. The thought surfaced on the walk home. It was not urgent. It was the kind of thing that pressed at the edge of attention, small, specific, refusing to settle. The coat had been worn through at the elbows, repaired twice at the collar. The kind of coat a man wore when he had nothing else. But the boots, visible when she had pulled him away from the guard, had been good leather, recently resoled, without the warping that came from sleeping in them or walking through repeated wet. And the hands. When she'd gripped his arm, she'd felt the particular quality of a person who had chosen to be still. Not a man emptied of resistance. A man who had decided not to move. She stopped at the edge of the lane. A royal retinue had arrived the night before, carrying the king's own crest. She spent the better part of an hour moving through the market's quieter edges. A word with the woman who sold candles near the east gate, who had seen everything and everyone from that corner for years. A question to the boy who watered horses at the South Inn. The retinue was large, the east wing of the main inn given over to it. No names offered openly. The crest was the king's household, not a traveling noble. She had never seen the king's face. She knew the person in the patched coat could have been a guard, a steward, an advance scout, any number of things. She also knew that a person who wore clothes that did not fit their role was usually wearing them for a reason. And she knew, without wanting to think too closely about the knowing, that in the 3 seconds she had gripped his arm to steer him away from the guard, something had pressed against the careful flatness she maintained, something that had recognized and pulled, quick and certain, before she had walked it back down. She had been managing that particular problem for 4 years. She was not going to let a pair of well-made boots undo that. She went to the well at the end of the farrier's lane anyway. The lane was empty. Damp leaves had gathered at the base of the well, pushed there by the morning wind. No sign of anyone. She stood for a moment with the basket at her side, looked at the empty lane, and then turned and walked back toward the market road. He was gone. The thread had no end she could pull. She told herself that was correct and believed most of it. In the east wing of the main inn, Cassian did not move for a long time after Edrin left. He'd been in Aldemar 3 days, 3 mornings in the patched coat, walking the market's edges, watching the way small commerce built into larger patterns when you looked at it long enough. The Omega disappearances before each of the last 3 designations pointed here, to this city, to these contact points. Someone was selecting names from the council's rolls before they were finalized, and the selections all traced back through the same routes. He had a strong suspicion about whose routes. He'd been building it carefully for months. But suspicion and proof were different things. and the man he suspected sat at the council's right hand and had been doing so for years, which meant the proof needed to be the kind that couldn't be argued away. He'd come to Aldemar for that proof. He had not come for the woman. 3 seconds. Her coat across his shoulders, her hand gripping his arm with the particular firmness of someone who had performed that exact gesture enough times to have it down to its essential parts. And in those 3 seconds, his wolf had done something it had not done in 32 years. It had gone completely still. Not the stillness before action, not the controlled readiness he'd spent his whole adult life maintaining. The stillness of a creature that had stopped looking because it had arrived. The bond had pressed through the chemical suppressor she wore. He'd registered the artificial flatness of it instantly, the real scent underneath bleeding through in fragments, something green and warm that his wolf recognized with a certainty that bypassed everything he thought he knew about how this was supposed to feel. He'd spent years assuming he simply didn't have one, that there were alpha kings who didn't. She'd felt the response. He'd watched her manage it, the exhale, the deliberate set of her shoulders, the decision not to look back. Not surprise. Management. She'd been managing this for a long time, long enough to have a practiced route for it. She'd given him directions and walked away, and that was... He turned words over and discarded them. Not the behavior of someone startled. It was the behavior of someone who had decided already that the correct action was to move on. He'd gone to the lane above the farrier's well and watched from a distance. She had come to check. She'd stood at the well, assessed the empty space, and left with the unhurried step of someone drawing a conclusion she had already halfway prepared for. She was careful, methodical, not frightened, something more controlled than fright. Edrin had come in while he was still turning it over. The retinue is ready to move. We stay another day. Edrin didn't argue. He knew better. The contact you've been watching? Her, Cassian said. A pause. Edrin was a man who picked his questions carefully. Her. She runs the network, or part of it. She moved through every contact point I identified this morning within the first hour of the market. And she wears a suppressor, which means she has a supplier in Aldemar she can't get anywhere else. He stood. When she goes to the capital, she goes without the supply. That's a vulnerability, and she knows it. You think she's been summoned? I think she will be. He crossed to the window. The square below was quieting, the last of the morning merchants packing down. I want to know her name before she knows mine. Edrin accepted this. I'll start with the candle vendor near the gate. Carefully. Always. He left. Cassian stayed at the window. Somewhere in the city, a woman with dark braided hair and a scar on her left hand was walking home with a basket of herbs that would run out in 4 weeks. He thought about what it cost to suppress a bond for 4 years, what it meant that she'd done it long enough to have a routine. He thought about his father, who had told him once that the bond would find him when it was ready, and not before. Cassian had filed that alongside the other things his father had said that sounded like comfort and functioned like nothing at all. He put the coat back on and went out to find the candle vendor himself. The summons arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a rider in royal livery who did not dismount and did not wait for a response. Nell stood in the doorway of the small room she kept above the coopersmith's workshop and read the document twice. The language was formal and indirect. She was requested to present herself at the capital in the matter of an incident involving the crown, her presence being necessary to complete an inquiry. No accusation named, no charge listed. The word witness appeared twice. She folded the document and set it on the table. 3 days. That was what she allowed herself. The first day she spent with Bryn. They walked the lower market in pieces, circling back twice to be certain no one followed, and Nell talked through everything. The Thursday delivery, the 2 women on the northern route, Tess. Bryn listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Nell valued most about her. She waited until Nell had finished before asking a single question. Tess is 10 days from ready. I know. You'll be gone. I know that too. Nell kept her voice level. She needs to be moved before the designation sweep in the 3rd week. That's a narrow window. If it closes before she's out, she goes on the priority list and we lose access. Bryn was quiet for a moment. They had reached the edge of the lower market, the Coopersmith's lane stretching ahead. "I'll handle it." She trusts people quickly. Don't let that be a problem. It won't be. Nell did not say what she was thinking, which was that she did not want to leave Tess in anyone's hands but her own. It was not a useful thing to say. It was not a fair thing to say either, because Bryn had been doing this work as long as she had, and had never lost anyone on her watch. The feeling had no logic in it. She let it sit without giving it language. They parted at the lane's end. Bryn did not say good luck. Neither did Nell. The second day she burned the records. Not all of them, the ones with names, the ones that tracked movement and supply, and the routes north. The ones that carried addresses. She did it in the iron stove in the Coopersmith's back room, while the grandson stood watch in the alley, and she fed the pages in slowly to make certain each one was gone before adding the next. 2 hours. When she finished, she raked the ash until it became indistinguishable from old coal. What she kept was in her head. That was where it had always mattered. On the third day, she went to Peter. He was behind his stall in the covered lane, sorting the same way she always found him. He looked up when she arrived, registered her face, and reached under the table. "No," she said. "I need to tell you something." He set down the stalks in his hands. She told him she was going to the capital, that she didn't know how long, that she would not be sending anyone to him while she was away. She did not mention the summons. What she told him communicated enough. The route through Aldemar was going quiet for a period, and he should not leave anything under her name that could be found. He listened with the same lack of expression he brought to everything. When she finished, he nodded and reached under the table again. This time he produced a smaller bundle than usual, tied tighter. "For the road," he said. She took it. She knew better than to calculate how far it would stretch in the capital, where the nearest reliable source was nowhere she could safely access. She took it because there was nothing else to take. The road to Drenthal was 3 days in a hired cart with 2 other passengers who spoke to each other and not to her, which suited her fine. She spent the time working through contingencies. If the summons was about the market, she had a clean version of that day, and she would hold to it. A man being accosted, an instinct she couldn't explain, a coat she didn't need. She had no name, no rank, nothing connecting her to the retinue beyond a woman who had stepped in on what looked like a rough handling and then walked away. Nothing in that account was untrue. If the summons was about the network, the work that mattered was already done. The records were gone. The roots in her head would stay there. She couldn't be made to produce what didn't exist in writing. What she couldn't account for was the suppressor. She had enough for 3 weeks, perhaps 4, if she pressed the dosing. After that, the wolf would begin asserting itself in ways that were small at first, but visible to anyone with shifter blood who was paying attention, and a palace full of court alphas meant someone was always paying attention. The bond had already demonstrated it could push through the chemical barrier when the concentration thinned. At the market, when her hand had closed on the stranger's arm, the pull had been sharp enough to stop her breath for a full second. She did not think about who he might have been. She had gone to the farrier's well and found no one. Whatever thread had existed ended there. Drenthal was larger than she had prepared herself for. She had been to the capital once, at 14, for a festival her father had insisted they see. She remembered the towers and the press of people, and the way the palace sat at the city's center like something that had grown there over centuries and expected the city to arrange itself accordingly, which was more or less what had happened. She was taken to the palace directly from the city gate, escorted by 2 members of the royal household who had been waiting at the entrance. Not guards, household staff. The room she was given was in the east wing, comfortable, with a proper fireplace and a window overlooking an inner courtyard. It was not a prisoner's room. The door also did not lock from the inside, which she noted without commenting on. She noted the room's position relative to the rest of the wing: 3rd floor, east wall, 2 corridors from the nearest stairwell. She noted the guard rotation in the courtyard below: 8-hour shifts, 2 per post, the south-facing post staffed by a man who leaned against the wall and looked toward the inner gate more often than outward. She noted the servants' passage at the end of the corridor, narrower than the main hall and unguarded. She did none of this in haste. She did it by existing in the space for 2 days and letting the information come to her. On the third day, a woman named Aldeth arrived at her room. Mid-40s, court dress, the kind of careful bearing built from years of making conversation feel effortless. She said she had been sent to help Nell become comfortable with the palace and to answer any questions about her stay. Nell thanked her and asked sensible, unremarkable questions. Meal arrangements, whether there was a library or a garden she might use, how long such inquiries as hers typically lasted before they were resolved. Aldeth answered all of them with practiced smoothness and gathered as much information as Nell offered, which was nothing of substance. After she left, Nell sat by the fire and considered the shape of what was being done to her. The room, the escort, the court woman sent to ease her into comfort. None of it was how you handled a witness to an unrelated market incident. It was how you kept someone present and cooperative while you decided what to do with them. She was not under arrest. She was under observation. She accepted that and adjusted accordingly. He watched her for 3 days before sending Aldeth. He had not spoken to Nell directly. Not yet. He needed to understand her before deciding how to approach her, and what he understood so far was this. She was more careful than almost anyone he had managed to keep in that wing, and she had mapped the palace's layout in 3 days with no apparent effort. A steward he trusted had counted how many times she walked specific corridors. The number corresponded precisely to the most efficient method of learning a building's structure without appearing to do so. She was also getting worse. He noticed the pallor first, on the second day. He dismissed it as travel. By the end of the first week, it had deepened, and with it came a tension in her posture that wasn't anxiety. He had seen enough genuine anxiety to know the difference. This was managed. Consciously, with an effort that showed in small ways. The extra beat before she answered questions, the slight adjustment she made every few hours as though recalibrating her own steadiness. The suppressor was thinning. He had encountered Omegas who used chemical suppressors before. Not often, not openly, but enough to recognize the artificial flatness overlaid on a real scent. What he had not encountered was one in proximity to an active bond. The bond had a great deal to say about the proximity, and he was spending considerable effort not acting on it. It pressed at him through council sessions, steady and insistent, the wolf angling toward the east wing with the mechanical certainty of something that had stopped searching because it had already arrived. He had learned to work through it. He had not learned to stop noticing it. He also spent the week crossing documents. It required care. Harwick had been on the council for 11 years, and the alterations to the designation law were the kind of small, compounding changes that read like administrative refinement to anyone who didn't have the original language in front of them. Cassian had the originals. He had kept copies of every law he'd signed since his second year of rule, a habit his chief steward considered excessive. He had never bothered to explain it. He simply kept them. The alterations had been made at the transcription stage, after signing, before official distribution. The language permitting physical reclamation of Omegas who had failed to register had not been in the version he approved. 3 separate clauses, all inserted without erasure, without annotation. Clean work. Whoever had done it had access to a skilled transcriptionist and enough time to move without hurry. What he lacked was a witness who could place those alterations specifically in Harwick's hands. What he had was a woman in the East Wing who had, by his count, examined every accessible designation record from the past 4 years with the focused attention of someone constructing a parallel account. She was reading those documents the way he read them, not for their official summary, but for the gap between what they said and what they should have said. She already suspected something was wrong with those records. She had known before she arrived. He needed to understand how much she had put together. The approach through Aldeth had confirmed what he expected. She was not going to give anything through ease or comfort. He would need to speak to her himself, directly. Not yet. He would let her reach further into the archive first. Let her build the account until she had something worth protecting. The way she protected it would tell him more than anything she chose to say. He stood at the window of his study as the courtyard below went quiet with the approach of evening. The wolf had not settled. It had not settled since Aldemar, and he had stopped pretending that it would on its own. He gave himself one more week. The wolf marked that as optimistic and said nothing further. The records hall sat at the center of the palace's administrative wing, 3 floors below the council chambers and 1 above the steward's offices. It smelled of old parchment and the particular cold that settled in rooms with stone floors and insufficient fires. Nell had been given access to it without explanation. A clerk appeared at her door on the 8th morning and told her she was to report there. She had not asked why. The hall was long and narrow, lined on both sides with shelves reaching the ceiling, requiring a rolling ladder for the upper sections. At the far end, 2 clerks worked at low desks under a single window. They glanced up when she arrived, registered her as not their problem, and returned to their work. She was given a desk near the middle of the room, cleared of previous contents, with a lamp already lit against the poor light. On the desk, 6 years of designation rolls. She understood the arrangement immediately. Someone wanted to see what she would do with those documents. She sat down and opened the first ledger. The rolls were organized by district, then by year, then by household. Each Omega registered for the cycle was listed with name, age, district of residence, and assigned designation outcome: paired, deferred, or unregistered. She moved through the pages with steady attention, not hurrying, making no notes. She had not been given writing materials. That was also a choice someone had made. It didn't matter. She read and held. The pattern emerged on the 2nd day. The names she recognized, Omegas she had moved in the past 3 years, were all listed. No gaps, no erasures. But beside each name, the assignment outcome had been altered after the initial entry. She could tell by the ink density and the slight difference in hand. Whoever made the corrections wrote with less pressure than the original clerk. 3 sets of alterations in the current year's rolls alone, all in the same correcting hand, all converting a deferred notation to a classification she didn't recognize, a code that appeared nowhere in the older records. She turned the lamp slightly and examined the altered notations more closely. New code, introduced in the last 4 years, applied retroactively in at least 2 earlier ledgers, added to the margins in the same correcting hand. Someone had created a classification that hadn't existed when these Omegas were first registered, then reached back into older records to apply it. She closed the ledger and opened the next. By the end of the first week, she had read 4 years of records and held every altered name and notation in a structure organized by year, district, and alteration pattern. She had not spoken to the 2 clerks beyond what courtesy required. She had not asked for writing materials. She had not reacted visibly to anything she found. What she felt, working through those pages in the insufficient warmth of the records hall, had no clean word attached to it. Not anger. Anger was too simple. It was the particular sensation of a shape she had been building for years, finally resolving into a complete form, and finding the complete form worse than she had estimated. She had been moving people out of a system she understood to be unjust. She had not known the system had been specifically engineered to funnel certain people toward the worst outcomes. There was a difference between a bad law and a law that had been altered by someone with deliberate purpose. She sat with that on the walk back to her room each evening and kept it entirely off her face. The suppressor ran harder against her in the 2nd week. She knew the signs. A restlessness in her hands with no identifiable cause. The tendency of her attention to sharpen on sounds that didn't warrant it. Footsteps in the corridor, the creak of the building settling at night, the ambient presence of 2 alphas who crossed the hall on the 3rd morning, deep in conversation, both slowing almost imperceptibly as they passed her desk without knowing why. She watched them slow and adjusted the space she occupied in the room, turning her chair slightly, drawing herself in. The suppressor's effect was not total. It had never been total. At distance and in passing, it made her unreadable. Under sustained proximity, it was less reliable. She had still not seen the Alpha King. She had seen his household, his guards, his clerks, his stewards. She had heard his name used in corridors with the brevity of people who had said it often enough that it became functional rather than formal. Cassian. She had attached it to a general shape of presence she had not located and continued her work. On the 12th day, the work nearly ended her. She was alone in the records hall. Both clerks had gone to the midday meal. She had stayed, claiming she wasn't hungry, which was partly true, and partly that the particular ledger she was reading, the Northern Districts, 2 years prior, required more time than she had been able to give it. The ledger was open to a page with 7 alterations in the correcting hand. She was reading the third when the dose she had taken that morning began to thin faster than she had calculated. She felt it go, not all at once, but the way a sound drops out of a room. One moment present, the next not, the absence louder than the thing itself. The wolf came up. Not fully. She had enough practice and enough iron in her to prevent a complete surface. But her hands changed against the ledger before she caught it, nails lengthening and darkening, while she pressed both palms flat to the page and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth in a count she had practiced so many times it lived below thought. It took longer than it should have. When she came back, both hands were hers again. The ledger had a faint impression where her fingers had pressed too hard. She smoothed it carefully and did not look up. Cassian was standing at the entrance to the hall. She did not know how long he had been there. Long enough. The distance between the entrance and her desk was the length of the room, and even across it, she registered him with a completeness that had nothing to do with sight. The bond pushed up through the thin suppressor, like pressure finding a seam. She locked it down and looked at the ledger. "The Northern Districts from 2 years ago," he said. His voice was conversational, unbothered. "Yes." He came into the hall, not toward her desk. He went to the far end, to the shelves below the window, and looked at the spines of the ledgers there with the ease of someone familiar with the room. He pulled one, opened it, read for a moment. She returned to her page. He did not leave. This became the pattern of the following 3 days. He appeared in the records hall late in the morning, examined something of his own, and existed in the space without making demands on it. He did not ask her questions. He did not explain his presence. On the second occasion, he brought 2 cups from the kitchens and set one at the edge of her desk without comment. She drank it. She was not going to be proud about warmth in a cold room. On the third occasion, he sat at the desk adjacent to hers. Not close, adjacent. For the first 3 hours, they worked in the same room without a word. Then he said, "What do you know about the designation law as it was written before the current administration?" It was not quite a question. She did not look up. "Enough to read these records. What do you see in them?" She set her pen down. He had arranged for writing materials to be brought in the second week. She was certain of that. She looked at the open ledger. Alterations. In a consistent hand across multiple years of records. Applied to a specific category of omega, clustered in the northern and eastern districts. The classification they were moved into didn't exist in the law, as I understand it. Silence. "It didn't exist in the law as I signed it," he said. She looked up. He was reading the ledger in front of him. His expression was closed. "That classification was introduced at the transcription stage, after I signed." She thought about what it would mean to say what she was thinking, and what it would cost not to. "Then someone with access to the transcription process has been engineering an alternative outcome for specific registered omegas," she said, "for at least 4 years. Yes, and you're telling me this." He looked up from the ledger. Yes. She held his gaze a moment longer than was comfortable, then returned to her work. Her hands were steady. Her pulse was not, but that was no longer only about the suppressor, and she was not going to examine that with any precision. He told her about his father that same evening. Not as a declaration, as the trailing edge of something else. They had moved from the records hall to a smaller reading room adjacent to it. 2 chairs, an actual working fireplace, because the main hall had gone too cold to think in. They were working through the Northern District records, her holding the information from the ledgers in structures he could follow, him matching it against what he carried in his own memory. At some point, she said carefully that she had understood from a young age what the designation cycle cost families who went through it badly. He asked what she meant by badly, not pressing, and she said only that her father had not recovered well from a loss that the bond had made compound in ways she still lacked language for. She stopped there. He recognized the stopping. "My father told me the bond was a destination," he said, "that once it resolved, everything prior to it would make sense from the perspective of after." A pause. He said it the way he said things he wasn't certain of, but wanted to be. She was quiet. "I don't know if he was right," he said. "I know what I've watched it do to people who got it badly timed or badly matched." She stared at the fire. "My father never shifted after my mother died. 12 years. His wolf simply stopped." She exhaled slowly. "He's alive. He functions. He's not the same person." A long pause. "The bond doesn't end when the person does. That's what they don't explain when they tell you it's a destination." He did not offer comfort. She didn't want it. He said, "No, they don't explain that part." They sat with it. The fire was the loudest thing in the room. She stood eventually and said she needed sleep. He let her go. He stayed in the reading room for another hour and considered a woman who had been managing her wolf's second-hand grief against her father's for years, and had found that the logical end of that management was to remove herself from the system entirely. He considered what it meant that the system she had removed herself from had been altered by someone on his council without his knowledge. Two separate problems, related at the root. He was still working out which thread to pull first when the hour grew late and the fire reduced itself to coals. The message came on a Thursday. Nell found it under the edge of her lamp when she returned from the records hall. A strip of paper, folded twice, in the particular way Bryn used when content needed to be brief and couldn't wait for a better medium. She unfolded it. 7 words and a location. Tess had been found. Men holding her. A house northeast of the city wall, identifiable by a blue mark on the gatepost. Not palace guards, not royal livery. Men working outside the sanction of the crown, which meant someone with resources enough to hire privately and confidence enough to deploy them within 3 miles of the capital. She read it twice, held it, and pressed the paper to the lamp until it was gone. She stood in the center of her room with her hands still. 10 days, she had told Bryn. Tess had needed 10 days before she was ready to travel. It had been 12 since Aldemar. Something had gone wrong in the timing, and now Tess was in a house to the northeast with men who had not gone through any official channel to put her there. Bryn's message had not said she could handle it herself. Bryn would have said so if that were true. She went to the window. The guard on the south post leaned against the wall, looking toward the inner gate. The servants' passage at the end of the corridor was dark and unguarded. The northeast wall sat roughly 40 minutes on foot from the palace's east exit, by the map she had built from 3 days of careful movement through the city's accessible streets. The footgate stayed open until the 3rd bell. She needed Tess out before the 3rd bell. She went to bed and lay still for 2 hours working through the timing. She let herself consider the obvious alternative once: the corridor, the door, the man who had said, "After I signed," with the flatness of someone already past the anger of it, and then set it aside. Going to Cassian meant waking staff, naming Bryn, explaining Tess before Tess was in hand, and trusting that none of that would reach the wrong ear before she reached the house. It might have been the better choice by morning. It was not the faster one now, and Tess had no time for uncertainty disguised as procedure. At the 2nd bell she rose, dressed in the darkest things she had brought, and went to the servants' passage at the end of the corridor. The servants' passage ran behind the east wing and led out through a door beside the kitchen stores, bolted from the inside with a simple bar that lifted without noise. Nell had confirmed this on her 2nd full day in the palace when she told the kitchen steward she was looking for the root cellar. She crossed the inner courtyard at the edge of the lamplight, keeping to the shadow of the wall until she reached the east gate. The foot gate was open. A single guard stood post there, young, arms crossed against the cold, watching the empty road with the expression of a man counting the minutes until his replacement. She walked through. The city at 2nd bell was reduced, but not empty. Merchants heading home through the East Market, a few groups outside a tavern near the main road, a lamplighter moving between posts with the unhurried pace of someone with rounds to finish. Nobody who would remember a woman on foot moving northeast. She had the location from Bryn's message. Northeast of the city wall, blue mark on the gatepost, 40 minutes at a pace she could sustain without drawing attention. She had committed the route before burning the paper, tracing it against the map built over days of movement through accessible streets. The house appeared exactly where the distance said it would. It was a working house, modest, the kind used for storage or a craftsman's overflow, with a small yard behind a low fence. A blue smear on the right gatepost, paint or dye, recently applied. Lamplight behind a shuttered ground floor window. No visible guard outside. She circled the property once along the adjacent lane. One entrance at the front. A low window on the east side, shuttered but not latched. She could see the sliver of light between the shutter and the frame from the lane. The yard behind the fence held a stack of timber near the back wall. A cat watched her from the fence post and then lost interest. She went over the fence on the eastern side, cleared the timber stack, and came to the low window. Two voices inside. Men, unhurried, the cadence of people who had been waiting long enough to grow comfortable about it. A third sound beneath them, periodic, quiet, someone shifting in a chair. Not distress, the sound of someone sitting in the same position too long. She went to the front door. She did not knock. She lifted the latch and stepped through. Two men at a table. One had food in front of him, a cup, the settled posture of a man with nothing urgent on his calendar. The other stood fast, chair scraping back. Tess was in the corner, wrists bound with cord on a low stool. She turned toward the door with the look of someone who had been waiting for it to open without certainty about what would come through. "I'm here for her," Nell said. "She walks out with me." The standing man's hand moved toward his belt. "You're holding an unregistered Omega in an unmarked house 3 miles from the palace," she said. "No mandate, no documentation, no chain to the crown." She kept her voice flat. "Whatever you were paid to do here, you were not paid enough to explain it to the king's steward." The man with the food was still. The man by the chair had his hand on his belt, but hadn't drawn. She watched the calculation pass through him. What he knew, what she might know, what his employer would want, whether any of those things aligned. "Who are you?" "The person taking her out. The rest doesn't concern you." He looked at Tess. Tess was already on her feet, hands in front of her, watching him with steady attention. 3 seconds. He stepped aside. Nell crossed the room and pulled the cord off Tess's wrists with 2 clean tugs. Tess rubbed her hands once. They left through the front door. Nell pulled it shut and walked at the pace Tess could match without running, north before turning south on the next lane. "Are you hurt?" "No." Tess's voice was thin but controlled. "They kept saying I was being relocated." "To where?" "They didn't say." Nell noted this without comment. The classification Tess had been moved into was built on a fabricated legal foundation. She had spent days in the records hall confirming that. A legitimate mandate would have come with royal documentation, a formal transfer chain. These men had been deployed by someone who knew the classification wouldn't survive scrutiny and had decided to act before scrutiny arrived. She was 3 streets from the South Road when she heard them. 4 men from the alley to her right, moving fast and without any interest in quiet. One carried a lamp. By its light, she caught the detail that mattered. No crest, no livery, not hired to be accountable. She stepped in front of Tess. The lead man slowed. "You took something that doesn't belong to you." "I took a person. That's a different thing." "Walk away. Leave her where she stands." Tess went rigid behind her. "No," Nell said. The lead man's hand came up. A 5th figure stepped into the lamplight from the far end of the alley, and all 4 men went completely still. She had built an understanding of Cassian over weeks of shared rooms, the economy of his movement, the quality of his attention, the particular stillness that was not passivity, but the composure of something large that had decided not to be urgent. In the alley, in the cold, with the lamp throwing uneven light across unpaved ground, he looked exactly like what he was. There was no ambiguity in it. The lead man looked once and stepped back. "No mandate," Cassian said. His voice carried the even quality of someone stating geography. "No documentation, no chain to the crown." A pause. "Leave." They left. The alley went quiet. The cat from the fence post appeared at the far end, examined the retreating men, and disappeared. Tess was rigid at Nell's back. Nell stood in the cold with the road dust and the guttering lamp and the full understanding that the suppressor had given out sometime between the house and here. The last of it gone, the absence sharp in the way that silence after a long sound was sharp. What remained was 4 years of managed distance, and Cassian 8 feet away, and a wolf with nothing left to work against. She held it. Barely. Cassian looked at Tess. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Can you reach the east gate without help?" "Yes." He shifted his attention to someone who had arrived behind Nell without her hearing. She turned and found an older man, household bearing rather than guard. "Edrin will take you through. You'll have transport and escort out of the city tonight. Unmarked." He paused. "You have somewhere to go." Tess looked at Nell. "There's a contact off the north road," Nell said. 3 turns past the main crossing, farmhouse with a red roof. "Tell them Nell sent her." She looked at Edrin. "They'll receive her." Edrin nodded. Tess went with him, looking back once, and then they were gone. The alley held nothing but the lamp and the cold and the 2 of them. Cassian looked at her. He did not speak. He was waiting, and the quality of the waiting told her he already understood the shape of what he was waiting for. She had been composing some version of this since the records hall. Every version had a false floor she could feel when she pressed on it. She stopped pressing. "I run a network," she said. 4 years, contact points in Aldemar and 3 other cities, moving omegas before the annual designation sweep. She kept her voice even. "I have moved 43 people. I have not lost one in transit." He said nothing. "I started it because I watched the mate bond take my father apart after my mother died. I kept doing it because the law I was working against turned out to be worse than I knew." A pause. "I don't know how much of that you already had." "Most of it," he said. "Not the number." 43. The lamp between them shifted with a draft from the lane. He stood with the information for a moment, and what she read in his face was not satisfaction at being confirmed, but something considerably less comfortable. "Of those 43, he said, how many had documented harm? Prior claims, injury records, formal complaints. She had run this calculation before he asked. In the records hall, in the reading room, in the hours alone in her room, accounting for everything she knew and had known. 31 had documentation I could verify. The other 12 were preventive, no recorded harm, but assigned to households with histories I could confirm from PAC records. None were simply refusing designation. No, silence. A door opened in a distant street and closed. The lamp continued its unsteady work. He was not performing thought. He was doing it. She watched him arrive somewhere, and then watched him decide what to do with where he'd arrived. Come back to the palace. And then there is considerable work to do. He moved toward the alley's end. For both of us. She stayed where she was for 3 full seconds. He did not look back to confirm she would follow. She followed. They walked the south road without speaking. The wolf was at the full surface the entire distance. The bond unmasked in a way she was managing through the same mechanisms she had used for years. Breath, pace, the deliberate occupation of attention. She could feel him doing the same from his direction, the slightly shortened quality of his breathing, the measured speed he maintained instead of the speed he could have. Neither of them said anything about it. At the east gate, the young guard registered Cassian's ring and found somewhere else for his attention. Inside the palace, Cassian stopped at the corridor junction. "There's a man named Harwick," he said. "He has controlled the transcription office for 11 years. The alterations in those records trace to his office." A pause. "He sent the men tonight." She had suspected a name for 2 weeks, since she'd read enough of the pattern to understand it required sustained institutional access. She had not been able to attach a name to it. She took this one and placed it in the structure she'd built. "When he finds out tonight, failed," she said. "He'll move faster than he has been." Cassian looked at the corridor, "Which means by morning, I need to have moved faster than he expects." He paused. "What you've memorized from those records, I'm going to need it. I know. Get some sleep." She went to her wing. She stood at the window looking down at the south courtyard where the guard held his usual post. The wolf was not settling. 4 years of managed distance left an absence she hadn't anticipated. Not painful, but structurally significant. The way a weight removed from a load-bearing point was significant even when the structure held. She thought about Tess on the North Road. She thought about Bryn, who had sent 7 words and a location because there was nothing else to send, and had trusted Nell to do something with them. She thought about 31 files with documentation and 12 without, and the question Cassian had asked in the alley, as though the answer genuinely mattered to what came next. She went to bed. Adrian brought confirmation before the 5th bell. Tess was clear of the city, on the North Road, with 2 men Cassian trusted and a cover story that would hold the 3 days it needed to hold. Cassian sat with the lamp low and the records before him. He had most of what he needed to move against Harwick. What he lacked was the earliest point in the chain. The instruction? The moment Harwick had communicated to the transcriptionist what changes to make. The correcting hand in those ledgers was professional, hired, and whoever had done the work had been chosen for discretion. Finding the transcriptionist would be slow. Turning one would be slower. But Nell had been reading those records from a different angle than he had. He had been following the process, the access points, the chain of custody, the structure of how the changes had been introduced. She had been following the outcomes, the names, the altered classifications, what happened to specific people after the records were changed. The 2 accounts together could close the gap that neither closed alone. He had not explained this to her yet. He had given her what she needed to act, which was the name. The rest would come in the morning. He pulled the next ledger and worked until the lamplight and the hour both made further work unreasonable. And then he sat for a while in the quiet of his study and accepted that the conversation the wolf had been pressing for since Aldemar was no longer something he could reasonably defer past the resolution of the immediate problem. It was, in fact, a separate problem that had developed its own momentum. He would address it when the first problem was closed enough to allow it the room it required. He looked at the remaining stack of documents and estimated how long that would take. The wolf offered no comment. It had, after all, been patient for 32 years. A few more days was not going to change its position. The morning after the alley, Nell returned to the records hall before the clerks arrived. She had slept 4 hours, which was more than she had expected. The wolf was at the surface in a way that was no longer manageable in the old sense. The suppressor was gone and would not be replaced until she found a way back to Aldemar and to Pater's stall, which was not a journey she could make in the current week. What she had instead was the practice she had built before she found the suppressor at 17 and 18 and 19, when management meant breathing and pace and the deliberate structure of attention and nothing else. It was harder without the chemical buffer. It was not impossible. She lit the lamp at her desk and opened the ledger she had stopped at the night before. Cassian arrived an hour later with 2 cups from the kitchens and his own stack of documents under his arm. He set a cup at the edge of her desk and took the adjacent one without comment. He never asked if she wanted the cup. He simply brought it and left it within reach. She had tried not to attach anything to that and had then found she had attached something to it anyway. "I need you to walk through the northern districts from the 3rd year back," he said. "The altered classifications or the full ledger. The alterations first, then the names beside them." She had the structure assembled in the way she assembled everything, by order and anchor, each name connected to a district and a date and an outcome. The altered notations sitting beside their original classifications. She began moving through them. Cassian listened and matched each name against the documents he had brought, cross-referencing against what she gave him. They worked for 3 hours without interruption. At the end of it, he sat back and looked at the papers in front of him. "The transcriptionist used 3 different hands across the 3 years," he said. "I thought it was one person changing their style. You've just told me the 3rd year names cluster in the eastern districts, which puts them in a different administrative batch, a different processing window. 3 people," she said, "or the same person working from a different instruction set. Either way, it traces to whoever gave the instruction. And instructions to the transcription office in this administration require written authorization through one desk." She looked at him. "Harwick," she said. "The authorization records are in the sub-archive below this hall. I couldn't access them without raising attention I wasn't ready to raise." He gathered the papers into order. "I can access them now." He stood and went to the hall's rear passage, which connected downward to a lower archive she had not been given access to. He used a key from his coat. She listened to his footsteps descend and returned to the ledger, holding what they had built and checking it against itself for gaps. There were none she could find. He came back 40 minutes later with a thin sheaf of papers and set them on the desk. She looked at the top page. Written authorizations from the transcription office, countersigned by the appropriate administrative authority. The signature was consistent across the 3-year span, and it matched the name she had been given in an alley 3 nights ago. 12 authorizations, each one moving a batch of designation records through a secondary correction process that had no formal basis in the law as written. The authorization language described the corrections as administrative standardization. What they had produced was the systematic reclassification of 31 documented omegas and 12 others into a category that existed only in these altered records and had never been approved by the Crown. She sat with that for a moment. "He signed these himself," she said. "He did. That was careless. He had 11 years of no one looking. Carelessness builds." Cassian set the last page down. "These are enough. Combined with the ledger alterations and what you can testify to about the outcomes, where those people went after reclassification, it's a complete account." She looked at the lamp. "When?" "Today. Before he knows we have the authorization records." He picked up the sheaf. "I'll convene the council this afternoon. I need your account in written form before then, your testimony about the outcomes. What happened to the people whose names are on these pages after their records were changed? How much of the network does that implicate?" "None that I intend to act on." He was direct about it, not reassuring, stating a decision. "The network operated against laws that were not the laws I signed. Any enforcement premised on those alterations is void." He paused. "That is my position, and it will be formalized as part of the proceedings today. I am telling you this so you can write the testimony without managing what you include." She looked at him. He had a way of saying things that required her to adjust her expectation of what came next. She had noticed it first in the reading room, then in the alley, and now here, the particular quality of someone who had decided what was correct before he spoke, so that speaking was only delivery. "I'll have it ready before midday," she said. He left. She wrote for 2 hours. She did not soften the outcomes. She did not editorialize about the law or its construction, or the people who had built it. She wrote names, dates, movements, and what she knew of each person's situation at the point of contact. 31 with documentation she could source. 12 she described as preventive removals with verifiable basis. She gave the account the same structure she gave everything, anchored, ordered, without gaps she could not fill. When she finished, she went over it once and then set it in the center of the desk and went to her room to wash her face and think about nothing in particular for 20 minutes. Bryn's message arrived mid-afternoon. It came through the kitchen, a kitchen worker who had been delivering to the palace's south gate with a folded note tucked under the cover of a supply ledger. Nell's name on the outside in Bryn's hand. She read it in the corridor outside the kitchen, standing against the wall. The network was intact. The 2 women from the Thursday delivery were north of the ridge. 3 others in transit before Nell left had reached their contacts. Bryn had heard through the city's lower channels that a provisional decree had suspended the upcoming designation cycle pending formal review. She had 12 omegas currently in various stages of movement and was adjusting their timings against the news. She asked whether she should continue moving them or hold. Nell folded the note. She stood in the corridor, with the kitchen noise behind her and the afternoon light coming through the single window at the passage's end. The decree. Cassian had moved that without telling her. She worked out the timing. He would have done it before today, possibly before the night in the alley, as part of closing off the legal basis for Harwick's operation. It was a practical step. It was also the step that stopped the clock she had been running against for 4 years, and she had not known it had stopped until this moment. She found paper in the reading room and wrote back, "Continue moving, Maintain timing. The formal review will require time, but the grounds for designation enforcement are suspended. She sent it through the same kitchen channel. She went to the window and watched the courtyard below, which held nothing remarkable, just the ordinary movement of a palace in the afternoon. The wolf sat at the surface and watched with her, and she let it, because there was no longer anything to spend against it. Harwick's men came that night. She had not been asleep. She had been lying in the dark with the lamp out and the fire low, running the account she had written through its structure one more time, finding the same conclusion at the end of each path. The authorization records closed the gap. The council session had already happened. She had been told by a steward that it concluded before the evening meal, and the steward's face had carried the specific careful neutrality of someone who had witnessed something significant and been instructed not to discuss it. She heard them at the passage door. Not the main door. The servants' passage she had used 3 nights ago, the door that lifted without noise. Someone had given them the same information she had gathered, or they had gathered it themselves, and they came in quietly with the confidence of people who had done this kind of work before. She was off the bed before the latch lifted. Her options were limited by the room's geography. Window to the courtyard 3 floors down, main door to the corridor on the opposite wall, the passage door already compromised. She went for the main door. She made it through. The corridor was not empty. The first man through the passage was fast, and she was not at full capacity. The wolf was up, and her senses were sharp, but she had no weapon and had been awake for too long. She ran the corridor and made it to the stairwell and got 2 floors down before the second man cleared the distance between them. She did not go down. She went sideways. A cross passage she had mapped on day 3, narrow, running east toward the wing above the records hall. She could hear them behind her, 2 sets of feet, the particular sound of people who were not trying to be quiet anymore. The bond hit Cassian like a door coming off its frame. He had been in his study, 2 floors up and a wing over, working through the secondary documentation that the council session had opened access to. He had been managing the wolf's persistent commentary about the East Wing for weeks. What arrived through the bond at the second bell of the night was not commentary. It was alarm, direct and total, the kind of communication that bypassed language entirely. He was moving before he had made a decision about it. He took the connecting stair at speed, came through the upper level of the East Wing, and heard them. 2 people running, a third behind them in the cross passage. He came around the corner at the passage junction as Nell came out of the narrow hall at a run, and the man behind her cleared the turn. Cassian put himself between them. What happened next was brief and was not a negotiation. The man pulled up short. His partner arrived at the junction and stopped. Both of them looked at what was in front of them and made a fast, accurate assessment. They ran. He let them go. Edrin could trace them in the morning, and they would trace back to Harwick, which would be additional weight on a scale that was already tipped. Chasing them through the palace at night was not worth the distance from what was behind him. He turned. Nell was against the passage wall, breathing hard, watching him with the specific quality of attention she gave everything, not shaken, processing. The wolf was at her surface completely, no suppressor left to push against, and through the bond he could feel the wolf's alertness and the physical effort of managing it. His own wolf was doing nothing but standing at full attention, the way it had stood since the market in Aldemar, the way it had been trying to demonstrate a point for weeks now. He let it. "Are you hurt?" "No." She pushed off the wall. Her breathing was steadying. "They came through the servants' passage." "I know." He looked at the empty corridor. "Edrin will have them before morning. Harwick has nothing left to authorize anything. He was removed from the council 6 hours ago, and his administrative access was revoked as part of the proceedings. This was residual. Men already deployed before the session, moving through service routes that still ran on loyalties he built years ago. She looked at him. "You knew he might move tonight. I thought it was possible. I should have had a guard on your passage door. I would have objected to that. I know that too." A pause. "I should have done it regardless." She made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. It had the quality of something surprised out of her by an answer she hadn't predicted. He had noticed that she made that sound in the reading room when he said something that landed differently than she expected. He had, he admitted to himself, said several things specifically designed to produce it, which was its own kind of information about where he was. The corridor was empty and cold, and the second bell had not yet fully faded. "The bond," she said. "That's what brought you here." "Yes." She looked at the floor for a moment. Not away, examining something at close range. When she looked up, her expression was the considered one she wore when she was about to say something she had built into its final form. "I need to tell you something about my father," she said. "And I need you to hear it as the actual reason I've been running the suppressor for 4 years. Not as something to argue me out of." He waited. "The bond didn't destroy him because it was too strong," she said. "I used to believe that he had loved too much and the bond had made him brittle because of it." She paused. "But I watched him for 12 years after my mother died. What destroyed him was that he had no choice about how he entered the bond. No time to become the kind of person who could hold it when it broke. The bond arrived and made the choice for him, and he went in without foundations." She held his gaze. "I don't want to argue against the bond. I know what I've been feeling since Aldemar. I'm not pretending it isn't real." Her voice was level. "I want to choose how I enter it. I want to build foundations first, so that if something goes wrong, I am not my father in that house for 12 years. She exhaled. "That is what I'm asking for. Not avoidance. Choice." He was quiet for a full moment. "Yes," he said. She looked at him, waiting for the continuation, the qualifier, the condition, the thing that came after the yes that changed its shape. It didn't come. He meant it without amendment. The choice was hers to make. The pace was hers to set. And that was not a concession, but a position he had held before she finished speaking. She could see it, that it was not a calculated answer, not the kind of careful management she had watched him perform in the council chamber and across weeks of shared rooms. He had simply answered. She stood in the corridor with that for a moment. "I don't know how long it will take," she said finally. "That's an acceptable answer." He looked at the passage toward the main stairs. The council session produced a full review commission for the designation law. It will need people with documented knowledge of how the alterations were applied in practice. People who know what those altered classifications produced in the field. He paused. "I am asking you officially. That work will take months." "Months," she repeated. "Possibly longer." She thought about Bryn with 12 Omegas in transit, adjusting timings against a decree that had suspended a cycle but not resolved the underlying structure. She thought about Tess on the North Road with 2 men and a cover story. She thought about 31 files with documentation and the 12 without it, and how none of them were finished being accounted for because the law that had failed them had not yet been replaced by anything better. "I'll need to bring someone in from Aldemar," she said. "She knows the field work better than anyone I have. If this commission is going to have any practical basis, she should be part of it. Arrange it." "Her name is Bryn." He nodded. "I'll have an official appointment drafted. Her role, a title, and a formal remit." He paused. "Full access to the records." Nell looked at the window at the end of the corridor, the city beyond it dark under a low sky. The wolf was at the surface and no longer working against her. Present, attentive, waiting the way Cassian had waited in the alley, without demanding. She had built a network on the premise that the system could not be argued into correction from the outside. She had understood that to be structural, a property of the system itself. What she was being offered was not an argument from outside. It was access to the mechanism with someone who had already demonstrated a willingness to use it. She did not trust that easily. 4 years of deliberate distance had not made her a person who trusted easily. But she trusted evidence, and she trusted what people did under pressure rather than what they said in comfort. And she had now watched Cassian operate under pressure for weeks. "Then we start with the eastern districts," she said. "The third-year records are the most complete, and they establish the alteration pattern most clearly. If the commission is going to build a replacement framework, those records are the baseline." "Tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow morning," she agreed. He left toward the main stairwell. She stayed at the window for a moment, the city below her, the wolf quiet in a way that was not suppressed but settled, present and no longer working against anything because there was nothing left to work against. She went back to her room, built the fire up properly, and slept until the light came.